Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Bridgehead. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'll be your host for the next half hour. Now, the person we're talking to today is somebody I actually first spotted on social media. She's a Danish journalist, and her name is Iben Thranholm, and I'm really hoping that I didn't maul her Danish name with a Dutch pronunciation. But she examines political and social events, and especially focuses on a lot of religious aspects and the moral implications of things that are happening. She's actually one of Denmark's most widely read columnists. She's a former editor, and she's a radio host at the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. She's traveled quite extensively to research these topics, including across the Middle East, the United States, and even Russia. She has a lot of very fascinating interviews with people relating to different issues. But I first noticed her because a YouTube video surfaced on my social media feeds of her debating a European reporter on television. And that reporter was essentially asking Iben for her take on what was going on in Europe in response to the migrant crisis. Now, as many of you will know, the migrant crisis in Europe has also resulted in a sexual assault crisis. Over 1,000 women were sexually assaulted in Cologne, Germany, and the stories of migrants sexually assaulting European women seem to pop up with shocking regularity. In fact, I think just 2 days ago, I saw one of these stories pop up where 2 migrant men had raped a woman in her 50s and told the judge that they did so essentially because they just had a bad day. Now, I don't want to linger on that too much because that's not the purpose of the show, because what Iben was talking about was not just the sexual assault crisis, but the response of European men to this crisis, which she said proved that there was a crisis in European masculinity. And the example that was being discussed was a group of Dutch men, and I'm ashamed to say it, who literally responded to a wave of sexual assault across Europe by dressing up in miniskirts, some of them shaving their legs, and marching down streets in Holland declaring that sexual assault was not a woman problem. And Iben was essentially asking, what is wrong with these men? Men are supposed to protect women, protect children, protect the culture, and instead you have them in miniskirts? And the interviewer responded to her by saying, yeah, but you know, the warm, inclusive, effeminate masculinity that defines Europe now, in her view, is something that is promoted by the European Union. And she pointed out one of the age-old tropes that, you know, allowing any sort of aggression in males leads to aggressive males, which leads to war. That's quite the leap, of course, but that's what the interviewer was saying. And Iben responded by pointing out, yes, but in all of human history, we have needed these traits, and it's not just about fighting wars, it's also about fighting back. And in her view, European men had lost the will or lost the ability to fight back against people coming from an area of the world where they have a very defined set of values, but those values differ widely from ours. So I fired her a message over Facebook, and sometime later she got back to me and said she'd be happy to have a conversation about all of these issues. And so I called her in Copenhagen, Denmark, and we chatted for about 40 minutes, and this is that conversation. I'll start off by asking you the question that sort of led to this interview, which is I've noticed on a lot of different shows across Europe, and it's even surfaced on a few Canadian shows, that the migrant crisis in Europe has exposed a crisis in European masculinity. What were the events that led you to make this point in the media?
It was the incidence of sexual assault in Cologne, Germany on New Year's Eve. I was just shocked to see what was happening, and what really shocked me was that all these women were alone on the streets, and when this happened, of course there were men among them, but when this happened, there were no reports about men, trying to interfere, trying to defend those women. And it means that many European men was obviously not capable of doing some kind of what do you call it? That they could defend those women. Mm-hmm. And I think that just was a clear sign that the masculinity in Europe is lacking and has been lost. And if you look to European politics right now, it's like all about inclusion, about soft values, trying to love your neighbor, embracing other people, open borders, like a woman that is, receptive. So European politics is all about that. You don't see, politicians defending the borders, maybe they could even use the military to defend the borders, but you don't see that at all. So there is also the lack of masculinity within our politics. And our whole system is sort of, overtaken by feminism. And I think that is a sign of crisis, because in every culture there needs to be a balance between feminism and masculinity, and we don't see that anymore in Europe. So feminism has taken over on many levels, and this was just one sign that we are now dealing with a very aggressive male culture coming from the Islamic countries, and they don't care about equality and women's rights. They just see women as weaker than men, and they are actually also assaulting women. And we have had a lot of other stories with rapes across Europe right now, where it's only like one woman or two women, not like a mass assault, but it's happening all the time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, just to unpackage what you said there a bit, because on this side of the Atlantic, we've heard stories about there being a so-called a rape crisis from the migrants coming in, but there seems to be a lot of loud shouting on both sides. From what you've seen and what you've been reporting on, is this crisis fear-mongering, or does it really exist?
No, it's absolutely not fear-mongering. It is. It actually happens. And maybe it even happens to a larger extent than we know, because it seems that many media, or there was some kind of, a scandal in Sweden where media has been covering these assaults up, not to give good arguments to the right-wing politicians. So maybe there are even more assaults happening than we know, and also some women, they might be, embarrassed to tell about being raped. But it's in Germany, it's in Sweden, it's happening quite a lot of places, or there are other kind of, violent assaults. So it's true that the things in Europe are changing a lot. But of course it is so political, and there are people who really want these open borders and the influx of immigration, because they're feeding this kind of multicultural narrative. They're trying to cover up what is really going on. So there is this political battle going on. So the right wings are often, being accused of fear-mongering, which I think is very unjust. It's not true, because these things are actually happening.
Well, what's interesting is, so Barack Obama was in Canada yesterday, and he gave a speech in our parliament, and he talked about how there's no such thing as Western values, but there are universal values, and he was referring to a lot of the agendas that you're laying out. But as you point out, there's these people coming from places that do not hold those values, and it seems that these values aren't universal. But it seems to me, from what you said in other interviews and what you're saying now, is that we've lost some set of values that allowed us to respond to the types of things that are happening. And what in your mind has gotten lost? Because obviously it's not just, the love your neighbor attitude, which is something that, the Christian knights of old would have held as well. It has to be something even more visceral and something deeper than that.
I think it all comes down to the loss of our Christian faith. That's evident. But I mean, today many boys, they grew up with no father in the home. They have no male role models. So the average modern Western male has been feminized, and because they have had mothers who was in the 68 movement who basically wanted their boys to become women and to act like women. So they have no knowledge of many manly virtues, I would say, because virtue here is a very important word, because virtue is something that our Christian faith was providing back in time, and we have lost that. So it's virtues like courage, resolve, self-sacrifice, justice and temperance, and self-reliance, self-discipline, and honor. And I think Islam has a sense of those virtues in, I'm sorry to say this if I'm going to offend anybody, but in a perverted way, because it's very aggressive, it's very dominant, and it's also creating fear, So, the Christian understanding of those virtues was also very protective. It means that men, because they were brought up with those virtues, they had the sense of protecting society, protecting women and children, protecting values, protecting their own nation. Mm-hmm. And this has all been lost, basically because we have lost our faith in Christianity, but also because of feminism. So, it might be universal values because they are truth. They are representing the truth, but it has been lost, and it has been overtaken by a completely confusion, more corruption, I would even say. Mm-hmm. Because many people today are just occupied with individualism, and materialism is not greed, personal success, and just profit making. And you can't build a society on that. And that's obvious now what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, those virtues you listed, there's protecting, and you also, protecting, not patronizing as some would call it, but you also point out something that I think gets missed a lot, which is self-sacrifice. And when you said that, it reminded me of some news articles that came out on CNN just after a mass shooting in a theater in Aurora, Colorado a couple of years ago, and the story was about how many of the boyfriends had physically laid on top of their girlfriends and in many cases saved their lives. Their protective instinct kicked in the second danger hit. But you commented some time back on what you felt was a rather disgusting reaction by a group of Dutch men who put on miniskirts in reaction to the sexual assaults in Cologne.
Yeah, we don't need men to become women. We need men to protect women. And I think it's I would always say, even though it's very tragic, a beautiful story that those male in the theater actually had this kind of instinct feeling that they needed to protect the women. Because what is real masculinity? For me, it is very much related to self-sacrifice. Mm-hmm. That a man is able to protect and also give up his life like Christ did. Right. We have this male image from Christ, that he actually sacrificed himself to save other people. So this is the basics of Christian culture, and this is what we have lost. And that's why we see so much confusion and lack of masculinity and a kind of also masculine femininity that men really feel rejected from. They don't like women that are becoming too masculine. And that's also part of why there are so many divorces, so much, crisis within relationships, because those roles have been completely altered. Now men has become women and women has become men. And, it doesn't fit with our instincts and our nature. And that's why there is this completely more, even emotional confusion in Europe and in the whole West, I think.
Yeah, and you've hit on something important there, the values that are coming in from certain places in the Middle East, because essentially the prime characteristic of Islamic masculinity is conquest, whereas you pointed out the prime characteristic of Christian masculinity would be self-sacrifice, and there's an inherent difference between those two characteristics in regards to how men would treat women. But you're in Europe, and I can imagine that a lot of people would be quite upset with a lot of the things that you're saying, because you're talking essentially about a lot of, I won't say traditional gender roles, but you're saying natural gender roles, as in the genders are wired differently and wired in some cases for different things. How have your European counterparts in the media reacted to you stating something that, to be fair, would have been sort of a common belief 50 years ago?
Well, to my big surprise, I've got a lot of response when I was appearing on TV shows with these lack of masculinity point of view I have.
Right.
And to my big surprise, a lot of people agreed with me. I hardly had any negative comments, because people really could see that we have lost this thing in our culture, and it's a negative thing. So I was quite overwhelmed to see how much positive response I actually got. So I think a lot of people have realized that the postmodern project is dead and it's not working. The problem is just, what are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people are in this kind of, feel, the consequences of this crisis right now on many levels, on their personal life, in their political life, and the whole culture is suffering. But the problem is just, what are we going to do about it? Because it seems also now, also with the Brexit movement in the UK, that there is a bigger gap between the political class and the ordinary people. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of ordinary people are not stupid. They have understood those mechanisms as something is wrong. Right. But the problem is just that our political leaders has a kind of utopia policy. It means that they want to bring all people together. They want this kind of equality between the gender, people from different cultures, even religions. And in practice, it's not working.
Right.
It is a lot of division. It's a lot of frustration. It's a lot of turmoil, and it's not gonna bring Europe any good. So my suggestion is, and that's probably going to be a new thing that people would criticize me from. I don't know. Maybe I will get a lot of positive response as well. Is that the only thing that can save Europe now is to come back to our spiritual foundation, which is Christianity, which will learn us again all those virtues and all those values that we have lost. I don't see any other solution, because it seems to me there are no political solution anymore, because people don't have any confidence in our political leaders anymore. It's evident with the Brexit movement and what happens in England right now. It means that people have lost the confidence, and I think that's also why Donald Trump is so popular. It's because people realize there has been told lies for many years, and they don't want to accept this anymore. So there is I think there will be a big confrontation. But I think that if those people who are in this kind of movement against the political class do not try to reach out to something that is upbuilding, some kind of spiritual foundation, spiritual values, they're not going to make it, because then they really have no solid ground to stand at. And I think that's the problem, that they are in lack of those virtues and values that we lost when we decided not to conform our society to Christian values anymore.
Well, it's very interesting because, of course, the problems that you've been pointing out are cultural problems, and there has to be, cultural, or as you point out, spiritual solutions rather than political ones. But you mentioned the Brexit vote uncovering this sort of gap between the political elites and sort of your everyday citizen. And Bloomberg just recently published an article, I think, that uncovered that, and maybe this fits into what you've been saying. He said that a lot of these ordinary people, they wanted to be British, they wanted to be patriotic, God, Queen, and country, these things that they used to hold dear, whereas the elites were attached to what he called a rootless cosmopolitanism, whereas they're moving in the circles that they moved in, being British wasn't important, all these values weren't important, just moving from one capital city to the next, meeting with, your friends and living the high life, and that this has exposed this disconnect. To what degree in Europe do you think that disconnect is being exposed more and more? We heard a lot over here of other nations demanding their own referendums in the wake of Brexit. What's your take on that whole situation and how it applies to these cultural undercurrents we've been discussing?
I think that Brexit will inspire other countries, at least here in Denmark, in Copenhagen, where I reside. There is already a debate now whether Denmark should not have the same referendum. So I think it's coming, and France is also talking about it. Marine Le Pen has addressed it several times. And I think a lot of people want this sovereignty back. They want to take control, like the British said, over their own borders, their own politics. We don't want to be told from undemocratic leaders in the EU how to run our country.
Right.
And you could say that this is a kind of taking masculinity back in a way.
Right.
I think to stand up for your own country, to stand up for your values, to stand up for yourself, or even to defend yourself. I think that's very masculine. So I think this is very positive. I just hope that this movement, because I think it's going to be a movement within Europe, would come back to the real virtues. Because if it's going to be like this kind of superficial anger, you're just very angry about the whole system. I mean, that's a fantastic energy, and that helps you to move things. But in the end, you need to build on something that is positive and constructive. And I think a lot of those nationalistic movements, they have a problem because they're not rooted in anything that is sound spirituality or Christian virtues. It's just like this, they're very angry about the whole system, which I understand, but it's not enough because it's also negative, So you need to find something positive that is a better alternative. And then you need positive values, and you need to teach people those values again, and to dare to say that the postmodern project has failed. It has completely failed, and we see now that our culture is falling completely apart. It's totally collapsing. So what we actually have in Europe right now is a kind of cultural Marxism, which resembles actually the USSR a lot. I started to call EU for the EU-SSR, because it's more or less the same. And I think what we see now is a kind of resistance against this kind of utopian equality of everybody, which actually was the same thing in the Soviet Union. Everybody has to be equal. But there were some people that were more equal than others.
Right.
And everything just collapsed because it was built on a lie. And I think our leaders have been, lying for quite a long time now. So I think we're going to face the same situation as in the Soviet Union in many ways. That people are just realizing that it's not so fantastic. Paradise is not around the corner. On the contrary, it seems like everybody is going into a kind of civil war,
Mm-hmm.
So I think we should look to what happened in the East and realize that this could happen in the West as well.
And that's very interesting, because you point out that Christianity in its true form would be the answer to many of these challenges. But the difficulty we have here in North America is that Christianity is being presented to people as hateful, as bigoted. The opposition to gay marriage that's in Christianity is something that people should reject as almost vicious hatred. And it seems as if with the multicultural postmodern project that any ideology, any worldview can be accepted except for the one that gave us our civilization and gave us our values in the first place. So you see in the wake of, for example, an Islamic terrorist murdering close to 50 people in a gay nightclub in Orlando, that many of the politicians have turned around and said that Christians, with their opposition to gay marriage, have created the climate that spawned this Middle Eastern terrorist. So when you point out that you want to start proposing Christianity as the answer, and I don't know what this is like in Europe, I'm only speaking from the North American perspective, is there a chance that a lot of people will push back because Christianity has been recast from a faith that emphasized, loving your neighbor, self-sacrifice, and all these things, into a sort of a hateful, bigoted, narrow-minded point of view?
I know, but when I heard that comment from politicians that it was actually Christian who has made this climate of, hatred against homosexual, I would call this a diabolical twist, because it's completely to reverse truth into a lie.
Right.
And they're actually telling lies. And I think Christianity is based on the truth. And it means that the big problem in our time is that truth has been turned into something, I would even say, a lie, and a lie has been turned into something that is true. And this was exactly the same thing that happened in the Soviet Union with this kind of communism idea. And now we have the same spirit here. And I think you have to understand that what's going on in the world today is not only a political battle, it's a spiritual battle.
Right.
And it means that those evil forces, which today is disguised as freedom of speech, democracy, gay rights, all those things. It seems to be like a liberation, that everything, now we can be completely free. We don't have even to consider the Bible and the Word of God, because this would just make us feel like prisoners, in our own lives. And this is exactly the lie, that they sort of, have twisted what is good, what is truth, into something that seems to be just limiting people, and I think all these values that we have now is in a kind of opposition to Christianity. But you can be sure that those political forces, what they want to, like I said, it was a spiritual battle. they want to destroy God's project. And I mean, the gay issues are, a perfect issue to go against Christianity with, because you can always accuse Christians of saying this is not. You should be more tolerant. You should be more tolerant towards those people. But we know that even from natural law, that a man and a man cannot create a new life. A man and a woman can create a new life. And that's also because sexuality has been twisted enormously. Because, I mean, our sexual or our sexuality has been separated from procreating. It means that today people can have babies without even having sex.
Right.
They don't need to have sex to have a baby. And also it means that you will have and you will have sex with no intention of having any babies. So that was the sexual liberation already that sort of was watering down what is sexuality. It is meant to create a new life. So we know that two people of the same sex can never produce that. And in that sense, it's not right, because this is what sexuality was meant for, not just to enjoy myself, but to create a new life. So already when we lost that understanding, we opened the door. So it was difficult for us to say, why shouldn't two people of the same sex be able to have sex with each other? And why should we not be tolerant towards this? So, there are many layers. But I think that this is an attack on the order of God, the beauty of God. And you see the consequences. I mean, I think I saw a survey where it said that homosexuals were 3 times more likely to commit suicide than other people, even though they were in relationships. So many gay lives are not that gay; they're not that happy. But it's just something that the Western media would cover up to you. Right. That means I don't really think that those people are living, very happy lives, because they are not living in accordance with the order of God or natural law even. And there are the spiritual laws, moral laws, like we have natural laws. And if you are, in a kind of opposition to this, you can never be happy. But it's not allowed to say, because we have this kind of, tolerance police. And I think that's just getting very, very totalitarian. And this is the tricky part, is that our free democracy, our liberal democracy is turning totalitarian, at least for Christians, because now Christians are being arrested for hate speech, just expressing their concerns about homosexuality and that it is not right. And maybe even somebody would come after me just, from what I've been telling you right now. So it's not allowed to say anymore. And that in itself is very alarming. It's very alarming.
This is interesting, because obviously your critiques then of European masculinity have come from a complex Christian worldview that you hold very dear. And if you don't mind my asking, what is your own Christian background? Because you've obviously considered all of these cultural issues in the light of what Christianity has taught you.
Well, I was raised a Protestant, but then I studied theology at university. I have a master's degree. And then a few years after my degree, I decided to convert to Roman Catholicism. So I am a Catholic now, and I'm very happy to be a Catholic. So I am a convert to Catholicism.
And what would the state of Christianity in Scandinavia be? Because you're Danish, which is why I think a lot of people wouldn't have instinctively accused you of having these views because you were a Christian, because Scandinavia is notoriously secular. Out here in Canada, the left-wing Canadians sort of talk about Scandinavia longingly as a land of glorious socialism that we should all seek to emulate. So what's it like to be somebody holding the views that you hold in the profession that you are currently in with those sorts of beliefs?
Well, it's very difficult. Christianity is very secular and very, I would even say, left-wing, sort of. So it is a very liberal Christianity. So there are not many people like me here in Scandinavia, and that was one of the reasons why I decided to convert, because I wanted to be part of a church that was worldwide and hold other theological views. So that was part of why I decided to convert. So here, I mean, yeah, it's true for liberals, Denmark is a paradise.
Right.
So I understand that. If here, I mean, we were the first one to legalize abortion, pornography, things like that. Mm-hmm. But you also feel it here in our culture, because this is the most unspiritual culture I have ever experienced. That's why I need to go abroad from time to time just to get some fresh air, you know.
Right.
You know, here we have the welfare state, and the state provides everything for you from you're born until you die. And it's very neat, it's very cozy, everything works, but there is no spirituality. We are a third world country when it comes to faith and spirituality. So when you start to talk about faith, people won't have much understanding of what you're talking about. But the interesting thing is that people have an interest. So if I go to a dinner party or wherever I go, and people know who I am, or I tell them what I do, they start to ask me questions about religion. So it means, I think, there might be some kind of search for some, you know, answer to bigger questions. But in the end, I think that socialism and materialism has overcome Christianity or replaced it here. And it means that many people are very living in a kind of poverty when it comes to spirituality and to the bigger meaning of life. And I think that's very poor. I think it's very, very poor. Mm-hmm. And I think that the state now has replaced God. And that is what's happening in welfare states, is that the state becomes God. And the result is that many people here don't have any real joy. I mean, maybe many people think that to have a lot of material goods, to have a house, to have a car, to have everything you want would make you happy. But on the opposite, but actually the opposite is happening. We see a lot of very depressed people here. I think we're only 5 million people. I think it's up to 500,000 people who take happy pills, mm-hmm. Because they're very depressed.
Right.
And we have a very, very high, we have a lot of people who are addicted to alcohol. That's also a huge problem. So if they were truly happy, you know, they would not need to take all those drugs. So I think that is a sign that the welfare state, needs a soul, and we have lost that soul. And for many people, it means that die and that's it. And it's not enough for a human being. There needs to be a higher purpose, a higher goal with your life, mm-hmm. and then just serving the state, you know.
Okay, well, let's end this off with one final question that I've been thinking about as you've been speaking here. You mentioned things like abortion and pornography and the depression rates amongst people, and especially among people in certain lifestyles. We see dozens and dozens of new sexually transmitted diseases, many of them lethal, having come into being since the sexual revolution. But we also have a generation now that grew up without Christianity, right? One generation back, people rejected Christian values, but since then, this generation has lived with the results of the sexual revolution and secularism without realizing what it was that our society rejected in the first place. And now you say you present this inflammatory thesis on television about masculinity, and you get a lot of positive feedback. Do you think there's a chance that maybe a generation that doesn't know what was thrown away might want to seek those answers again?
I hope so, but it depends right now on the grown-ups, whether they will take responsibility and go back to the roots or they will not. Because somebody has to educate those young people. Mm-hmm. Of course, when they are going to get grown-ups, they might do some soul-searching themselves. But I think that what is very scary is that the biggest problem among young people today is self-destructive behavior. It means like cutting and, drugs and things like that. When I was a child, it was like crimes where people were stealing a car or they were just, throwing with stones or whatever. But now it's actually young people who are self-destructive. And I think that's also a spiritual problem, that they want to hurt themselves because they have so much pain inside that they just need to hurt themselves physically. And I think that the only way to heal that is through spirituality and going back to faith. I think it is actually a sign of lack of faith in something higher, because many young people here are left by their parents to make their own decisions about life, because we have this kind of relativism, which is actually nihilism. It means that parents today are scared of telling their children what to believe in, what to think, because they want the young people to find out themselves, which is obviously too big a responsibility when you're just 12 years old and your parents are divorced and you don't know anything about your life. So I think they need a father. And what has also been lost with the lack of masculinity is this aggression against the father. I mean, like Freud was against the father, made it a very critical issue with the father. And God is a father, you know. So I think that if the next generation could try to see God as this kind of loving father, not a dominant, aggressive father, but a loving father who wants to take care of them, I think there will be much healing in that.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about all of these really important issues.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.